There are some words that, when heard, carve deep wounds into your soul, especially when those words are spoken with the last breath of an innocent child. "Mommy, why?" This was not just a whisper, it was a scream. The echo of a small life ending, in unimaginable pain. This case etched itself into memory, not only for its tragedy but also for the mysterious veil of silence that surrounded it. Why were the details of such a horrific event seemingly suppressed from public knowledge? Why did mainstream news outlets turn a deaf ear to this cry? Today we break that silence. We pull back the curtain on the truth behind this banned nightmare. If you are prepared, we now journey behind those closed doors into one of humanity's darkest corners. This is the heartbreaking story of 7-year-old Leo Maxwell. It all began on the 17th of March 2022 with an unconventional call to the Oak Haven Police Department. A neighbor, their voice laced with concern, reported disturbing sounds emanating from 12 Elm Street and expressed worry for young Leo, who hadn't been seen for days. This wasn't a routine welfare check. The caller's tone suggested something was terribly wrong. Officer David Miller and his partner were the first to arrive on the scene. The house was silent from the outside, an almost eerie tranquility hanging in the air. They knocked, then announced their presence. No response. Given the nature of the call and the potential urgency, they made a lawful entry. The air inside was thick, stagnant. What they encountered within would shake even the most seasoned officers. A pungent odor of neglect and decay permeated every room, a chilling disarray painting a grim picture even before the central horror was fully comprehended. But the worst was yet to come. Officer Miller, his training kicking in but his voice trembling, radioed for immediate backup and detectives. "Dispatch," he managed, his voice strained, requesting immediate backup and detectives to 12 Elm Street. The situation is critical. The silence that followed on the radio was heavy with unspoken understanding. This was no ordinary call. In a small bedroom towards the back of the house, they confronted the horrifying truth. There, on a soiled mattress, lay little Leo Maxwell. It was clear this was no peaceful sleep. Crime scene investigators and paramedics were urgently summoned, but for Leo, it was far too late. The room itself seemed to weep. Leo's tiny body bore the silent, irrefutable evidence of prolonged and systematic torture. Initial observations pointed to severe malnutrition, dehydration, and numerous injuries, both old and new, a mosaic of suffering. The state of the room, the filth, the lack of basic comforts, the sparse broken toys, screamed of the unimaginable neglect the child had endured. It was a scene that defied easy description, a profound violation of all that is sacred about childhood. And then, perhaps the most chilling detail of all, a detail that would haunt everyone involved and ignite a firestorm if it were ever widely known. Words whispered to have been his last. Whether found on a scrap of paper, a faint recording on a discarded device nearby, or relayed later by a peripheral witness who had overheard a desperate plea through a thin wall, the message was the same: "Mommy, why?" These words, this desperate question from a suffering child to the one person who should have been his protector, would change the course of the investigation and had the potential to cause a public outcry, if they were ever allowed to be heard by a wider audience. Leo Maxwell was just 7 years old. He was a second grader at Oak Haven Elementary School. His teachers described him as a quiet, introspective, but bright child. He loved to draw, especially superheroes, perhaps finding in them the protectors he so desperately needed in his own life. He often spoke of wanting a dog, a simple childhood wish. Neighbors recalled seeing him occasionally playing alone in the yard, a solitary figure, but noted he had become increasingly reclusive in recent months. His father, Michael Evans, was estranged from Leo's mother, Sarah Maxwell, who had full custody. The fabric of Leo's young life was woven with threads of isolation and unseen pain. School records and some fragmented social services reports would later reveal that concerns about Leo's welfare had been raised previously. There were notes about unexplained absences, about a child who often seemed withdrawn or hungry. However, these flickers of concern were often dismissed with explanations of insufficient evidence or categorized as internal family matters, tragically failing to lead to any significant intervention. These were the missed opportunities, the unheeded cries for help, that paved the way for the ultimate tragedy. The system, it seemed, had looked away. All eyes quickly turned to the mother, Sarah Maxwell. Her demeanor at the scene was unsettling to investigators. She was calm, almost eerily detached, offering no visible outpouring of grief one might expect. During her initial questioning, her statements were contradictory and evasive. She claimed to have been unaware of the severity of Leo's condition, suggesting he had merely been a little unwell, that she'd been out running errands. An investigation into Sarah Maxwell's background began to unearth a troubled history. Reports indicated a turbulent childhood of her own, marked by instability and encounters with the foster care system. There were anecdotal accounts from former acquaintances of struggles with mental health and substance abuse, though no formal diagnosis was immediately apparent in accessible records. Friends, or rather former friends, described her as volatile, prone to periods of deep depression and social withdrawal. Her relationship with Leo's father had been tumultuous. A picture was forming of a young woman overwhelmed by life, possibly battling untreated mental illness and tragically ill-equipped for the responsibilities of motherhood. As the investigation deepened, it became horrifyingly clear that Sarah had come to view Leo not as her child, but as a burden, a repository, for her own frustrations and resentments, particularly those stemming from her acrimonious relationship with his father. She had become increasingly isolated, and in that isolation the unthinkable had festered. It was during this period that whispers also began to surface, whispers that Sarah Maxwell's family possessed certain local connections, and that subtle pressures were being applied to ensure the more gruesome details of the case did not immediately leak to the press. Was this an attempt to manage a family's shame, or something more calculated to obstruct the full glare of public scrutiny, and by extension, justice? This question hung heavy in the air as detectives pressed on. The autopsy report was a harrowing document, a clinical testament to unspeakable cruelty. It detailed that Leo's small body showed evidence of numerous bone fractures, some old and partially healed, others fresh, indicating a sustained period of abuse. There were burn marks, cuts, and signs of severe internal trauma. The official cause of death was listed as complications arising from long-term physical abuse, chronic malnutrition, and severe neglect. This was not a crime of sudden passion. It was the culmination of months, perhaps even years, of systematic torture. The medical examiner noted that the child must have endured unimaginable suffering. The evidence collected from the house corroborated the autopsy's grim findings and systematically dismantled Sarah Maxwell's initial claims of ignorance. Leo's room, investigators found, had effectively been a cell. There were indications he had been confined for extended periods. The scarcity of edible food and fresh water in the house, particularly in areas accessible to a child, was appalling. The hygiene conditions were deplorable, an environment utterly unfit for any human being, let alone a vulnerable 7-year-old. Furthermore, a forensic examination of Sarah Maxwell's phone and personal computer uncovered a disturbing search history, including queries related to controlling children and, more ominously, ways to conceal injuries. Digital fragments of notes she had made also painted a picture of a mother deeply resentful of her child. Witness statements began to form a more cohesive and damning narrative. Neighbors, now more forthcoming, recounted hearing muffled cries and arguments from the Maxwell home on multiple occasions over the past year. They spoke of a child who seemed to vanish from public view. Teachers from Oak Haven Elementary recalled instances where Leo had arrived at school with unexplained bruises or appearing excessively tired and hungry. Sarah's explanations, a fall, a clumsy accident, had been accepted at face value or, at least, not challenged sufficiently to trigger a more robust intervention. Previous reports from social services visits, when re-examined in the harsh light of Leo's death, appeared superficial. their conclusions tragically inadequate. They documented concerns but stopped short of decisive action. And then there was the matter of Leo's final heartbreaking words, "Mommy, why?" The exact source of this quote remained a point of some contention within the investigative team. One theory suggested a neighbor, living in an adjoining apartment, with thin walls, had overheard fragments of a child's distressed voice and relayed what they could recall to the police. Another posited that Leo in his final days might have scrawled the words on a hidden piece of paper, a desperate, silent plea. While the precise origin was never definitively established for the public record, the emotional weight of the phrase was undeniable. It became the symbol of his suffering, a haunting question that echoed through the entire investigation. The case of Leo Maxwell, when it first surfaced, received only brief and heavily sanitized coverage in the local Oakhaven media. The true extent of the horror, particularly the details of the prolonged torture and the chilling account of the child's purported last words, either never reached national news outlets or were significantly downplayed, almost as if a deliberate curtain of silence had been drawn. Allegations soon emerged suggesting that Sarah Maxwell's family, possessing some degree of local influence and connections, had actively worked to ensure the incident was framed as a private family tragedy, thereby minimizing the public dissemination of its more disturbing elements. Another theory, perhaps more insidious, was that the sheer unpalatable horror of the case led some media organizations to self-censor, possibly under the guise of protecting public sensibilities, or perhaps fearing the story was simply too graphic, too upsetting for their audience. However, the truth, as it often does, found ways to seep through the cracks. A small number of determined independent journalists, tenacious bloggers, and outraged social media activists began to pick at the edges of the official silence. Leaked information, anonymous tips from individuals close to the investigation, and the sheer moral weight of the injustice gradually started to stir the public conscience beyond Oakhaven. The question, "Mommy, why?" initially a whispered rumor, began to gain traction online, transforming into a hashtag, a rallying cry for those demanding a fuller accounting and for justice for Leo. The attempt to ban the news, to control the narrative, was beginning to unravel. With the overwhelming weight of forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Sarah Maxwell's own incriminating digital footprint, she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, torture, and multiple counts of felony child abuse. The subsequent legal proceedings, though not receiving the wall-to-wall national coverage a case of this magnitude might typically attract, nevertheless generated significant public interest, fueled by the details that had begun to circulate. Through unofficial channels, the prosecution meticulously laid out its case, presenting the grim findings of the autopsy report, the photographic evidence from the squalid home, and the heart-wrenching testimonies of those who had witnessed Leo's decline or Sarah's indifference. They painted a chilling picture of a mother who, through deliberate and sustained acts of cruelty and neglect, had methodically destroyed her own child. The digital evidence from Sarah's phone and computer provided a window into a disturbed mind, one that viewed Leo not with love, but with cold resentment. The defense team attempted to argue a case of diminished capacity, highlighting Sarah Maxwell's own troubled upbringing, her documented struggles with mental health, and a history of substance abuse. They portrayed her not as a monster, but as a broken individual, herself a victim of a system that had failed her, rendering her incapable of providing adequate care or fully comprehending the gravity of her actions and inactions. However, after weeks of harrowing testimony and days of deliberation, the jury, faced with the undeniable evidence of Leo's prolonged suffering and Sarah's role in it, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke of the unfathomable cruelty inflicted upon an innocent child and the profound betrayal of a mother's most sacred duty. Sarah Maxwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, in the eyes of the law, had been served. Yet, for those who knew Leo, even in passing, and for the community that had unknowingly harbored such darkness, no sentence could ever truly mend the wound or bring back the bright little boy whose life had been so cruelly extinguished. The tragic, death of Leo Maxwell sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom, serving as a grim testament not just to the failure of one individual, but to the potential failings within a community and its protective systems. The first responders who initially entered that house of horrors, Officer Miller and his colleagues, along with the paramedics, were deeply scarred by what they had witnessed. Many required extensive psychological counseling to process the trauma. Some, it was reported, found they could no longer continue in their chosen professions, the images from 12 Elm Street forever seared into their memories. The case brutally exposed the potential gaps in child protection services, the often insufficient nature of existing reporting mechanisms, and the pervasive societal reluctance to intervene in what is perceived as family matters. It was a stark reminder that the cost of looking away, of assuming someone else will act, can be devastatingly high. Leo's story became a painful lesson in collective responsibility. Furthermore, Leo's story, especially when intertwined with the persistent allegations of attempts to ban or suppress the full details from the news, ignited a fierce and necessary debate about media ethics, the responsibility of the press to report uncomfortable truths, and the insidious ways in which power or influence might be wielded to obstruct the free flow of information. It underscored the critical importance of a vigilant and independent press in holding power accountable and ensuring that the stories of the most vulnerable are not silenced. The truth, no matter how disturbing, demanded to be told. Leo Maxwell's last words, "Mommy, why?" echo far beyond the confines of that small, tragic room. They are not merely the question of a dying child to his mother, they are a question posed to all of us. Why do such tragedies continue to happen in our communities? Why do we, as a society, sometimes fail to protect our most vulnerable? Why do the warning signs go unheeded and the cries for help unheard until it is too late? To tell stories like Leo's is difficult. To hear them is perhaps even more so. But to forget, to turn away from such uncomfortable truths, is to risk allowing similar horrors to recur, to allow other children to suffer in silence. Keeping the memory of Leo and countless other innocent victims like him alive is not about dwelling on the darkness, but about shining a light on it, about giving voice to their silent screams. It is a responsibility we all share. If you ever suspect that a child in your community, in your neighborhood, or even in your extended family, is suffering from neglect or abuse, please do not remain silent. Do not assume someone else will step in. Reach out to the appropriate authorities. Your call, your report, your willingness to speak up could be the intervention that saves a child's life. It could be the action that prevents another "mommy, why" from ever being uttered. The very notion that this story or elements of it might have been banned or suppressed from wider public view is a chilling testament to how powerful and, at times, how deeply uncomfortable the unvarnished truth can be. But truth, especially when it concerns the suffering of the innocent, must always be brought into the light, no matter how painful it is to behold. For it is only by confronting these dark realities that we can hope to change them. To help important stories like this reach a wider audience and raise awareness, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.